perspectives, which we think are very complementary on this. And just to give you a range of who we have today is really policy leaders, people who have dedicated their lives to the betterment of other people's lives in public space. I'm extremely grateful for them for making the time to join us today. But they're going to start by giving us a bigger perspective, a policy perspective, if you will, on these topics. Then we will move tomorrow with a bit more of an academic perspective from a group that Mina Sikara, who's a professor of psychology, will be leading, thinking through the deep behavioral underpinnings of some of the themes that I imagine today's speakers will touch upon. We will also have a special session celebrating the 2019 Nobel laureates on Wednesday, as well as a keynote speech by Professor Michel Galfand, talking a bit about, similar to the themes of the conference, how understanding cultural norms, tight and loose culture is part of the book she has, and how they shape our current world as well. We'll then turn on Thursday to a perspective more from political science and political economy in understanding how this idea of identity shapes politics. And obviously we're all familiar with what's been happening over the last several years along these lines. Even today's speakers have personal experience with this. So the politics of identity, and we'll talk a bit about the political science perspective on that. And then we'll end on Friday with a keynote from Hugo Merciers on the enigma of reason, part of his book, but really trying to understand and go back to the essence of human reasoning. Because at the end of the day, all the forces we're talking about are being shaped by human behavior, whether it be a sense of identity of humans or how they perceive others and how they perceive their reactions to others will be taken. And so those are going to be, we hope, a consistent and complementary set of themes for the course of the week. So I'd really invite everyone to join us for the full week. We've tried to schedule sessions typically around late morning Eastern time. That way we hope that most people across the world would be able to join. We also are live streaming this event on YouTube, and so I encourage people to submit questions there as well, and we'll try and moderate those questions back to the speakers. Let me now introduce Melanie Kamet. Professor Melanie Kamet has been extremely generous with her time. I'm grateful for her joining. She's a political scientist who is a professor for international affairs in the Department of Government at Harvard University. She also is a chair of the Harvard Academy of International and Area Studies, and also the acting director of the Weatherhead Center. Melanie herself is an expert in the Middle East, and her own research is actually very appropriate to the themes being explored. She really explores the ideas of toleration, reconciliation, especially in context of ethno-religious violence and identity politics. So with that, I'm thrilled to have Melanie. I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you again, both to you, and thank you again to the illustrious speakers we have with us today.
Well, I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you, Asim, for that introduction. And delighted to moderate this important panel. I want to thank all of the participants and the attendees, including those streaming it. And I especially want to acknowledge that the Minister of Finance from Brunei, Dr. Amin, is going to be joining us. We're honored to have him with us. The title of today's panel is Overcoming Polarization in Diverse Nations. And I'm really hard pressed to think of a more important topic than this one these days. We're witnessing, as we all know, really fever-pitched levels of polarization. And across the globe, we see the rise of polarization across a variety of axes, not just ethnic and religious, as we often think of this phenomenon, but increasingly along ideological and political lines as well. Public discourse has become so intensely vitriolic and governments are divided that policymaking is really stymied in many places. And of course, I needn't remind all of us that the most pressing issues of our time, climate change, confronting this pandemic that we're in the midst of still, redressing all forms of inequality, require cooperation and, more profoundly, often a sense of social solidarity that supports sacrifices for the greater good. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing about the experiences of our eminent panelists who are going to shed light on what kinds of tools can help us overcome such divisiveness and how we might possibly build a better sense of us or we. So based on firsthand experiences, the panelists can directly speak about tensions in a variety of regions across the globe, whether it's the Middle East or South Africa after apartheid, Canada, Hungary, Colombia, and many more contexts where they have extensive experiences. So let me briefly introduce the speakers, and then I'll invite them to comment on this important topic. So first we have Sergio Fajardo, who's professor at the Monterrey Institute of Technology in Mexico. And he's the former mayor of Medellin and former governor of Antioquia, Colombia, where he led efforts to integrate back into civil life people that were involved in the conflict and supervised that process in the area where he was governing. Next, we have Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, former Minister of Welfare and Population Development and former Minister of Public Service and Administration in South Africa. She currently serves as Chancellor of Mandela University. And I should also note that she served as National Deputy Elections Coordinator for the African National Congress in the lead up to South Africa's first democratic elections after apartheid. Next, we have Michael Ignatieff, who is former leader of the Liberal Party of Canada and leader of the official opposition from 2008 until 2001. He currently serves as president of the Central European University, has lots of experience on human rights issues, and has been heading the university at a time of great tension in its longtime host country, Hungary, and had to oversee the relocation of the university to Vienna. And last but not least, we have Tawakol Karman, Nobel Peace Laureate in 2011 for her role in leading a pro-democracy protest movement in Yemen. She's the co-founder and leader of Women Journalists Without Chains, which was founded in 2005 to advocate for women's rights, civil rights, and freedom of expression. So this is a really great set of speakers. And what I want to do first is throw out a question that each of our speakers can respond to. I think it would be really interesting to hear more from all of your experiences with polarization in various country contexts, whether it's the one that you're in right now or elsewhere that you've encountered in your careers. And for each panelist, I want to understand more about what us versus them means to you. So if you could share any relevant examples from your regions of expertise, that would be great. Why don't we start with go in the order of the panelists as I introduce them, and we'll start with Sergio.
Well, hello. Glad to be here with you. Thank you very much for the invitation. This is my third time in this symposium, and I want to talk to you about my country, Colombia, and explain something that whenever I think about it, I said, I can't believe we are in the middle of this thing, but we are, and it's not easy, and we are in trouble. I'll explain. First, the problem that we have actually begins when former President Uribe confronted former President now Santos around an issue that in principle we would think that should have no discussion: building a peace process in order to get an agreement in Colombia. After more than 50 years of having guerrillas groups, a particular guerrilla group that has been painful in our society, destruction, and many other things that you may imagine. But these two persons, former President Uribe, who led the fight against FARC, and President Santos, who was his Minister of Defense when he became president, he began working on a peace process, and Uribe was against it. So from the very moment that it was announced that President Santos was going to work on a peace process, we have two confronting positions. President Uribe was against it. And it has been an increasing problem since around 2012 up to today. And it led to something that I think, again, unbelievable, that in the year 2016, 4 years ago, we have a plebiscite in order to ask Colombian people whether we agree with the agreement that has been achieved in La Habana in the negotiations or not. And to our surprise, the no people won by very slight margin, but the no won. So we became completely divided around the peace issue in our country. Those were the times of the Brexit, Trump, and unbelievable things were happening. We never thought this could happen. It happened. And since then, we have had a polarization that has that common root against peace or pro-peace, the way it was handled, and that translated into the presidential elections in the year 2018. I was a presidential candidate back then. And what happened was that the presidential election was divided. We were more than three candidates, and at the end, there were two who were confronted. On this one side, the people, President Duque, actual president of Colombia, who was with Uribe, and on the other side, on the left, Gustavo Petro, who was a former guerrilla member who had been going through a peace process from several years ago, and there we had a polarization in extreme. Actually, it was, and I am still am, fighting, that's not the correct word. We were proposing an alternative where we wanted to have change, but in order to build, and we said, not with the streams. They two came up, and the first and second in the first round of the election, and then went to the election that won President Duque. I almost made it to the second round, but we didn't. And since then, this polarization has been increasing around some issues that are growing up in Colombia. Actually, today there is a national movement, a national call to a strike to present to the government the resentment that we have in Colombia. And what has happened since then has been an increased process of being, you are with me or against me. We are friends or enemies. And they are trying to have no room for a different voice regarding what is happening in our country. Then we had polarization plus something that comes with it in the context that we have right now, associated with inequality, with corruption as something that is recognized in Colombia as something deep and troublesome for our country. And then we have polarization plus populism. And we are in the middle of a confrontation that is increasing day by day, associated then with the world divided into with me or against me. There is no room for any other thing, or they want to be no room for any other expressions. We are that expression that wants to say there is room, and actually there's more room beyond these two extremes. But that has become something very powerful in the sense of a language, aggressive, destruction, expressions of fear, rage, anger, every day we have a battle being fought in the social media, the digital world, and it's increasing. And the language is getting worse and worse, lies, fake news, aggressions. And of course, in a country like ours, where we have been working or we have been trying to build peace after 50 years, and we haven't been able to do it because we never managed to end up the work that we had. We have improved quite a lot, but it hasn't worked that way all the way. Then we have these conditions that make things worse, that are very dangerous because our history has shown that when the polarization grows as it is growing today, then the violence is right waiting for us in the next corner. So we are in the middle of a confrontation. We are several political forces in action today. I represent those who, as have said, we want to have change, but in order to build something in Colombia beyond, outside the extremes, but we use a different language. We respect people. We recognize people. We have empathy. We have solidarity, and we don't use the weapons associated with destruction in the middle of polarization. And that's a very difficult situation that we are going through. And that's part of what we are doing now, and the challenge that we have, how we can face this polarization and come up with an alternative that once and for all allow us to go into a real peace in our country. I emphasize the word, the phrase, we can be different without being enemies. We pay attention to the means in order to get to an end, as opposed to in this warlike situation that becomes polarization, where everything goes in order to destroy those who are different from us. And that's the challenge that we are living right now. We are in the middle of the situation, and we still have a long way to go because we have presidential elections in the year 2022. And that's what we are going to be seeing from here on, to see if we can manage to open up an alternative that defeats polarization the way it is being carried out today. That's where we stand. I have some ideas about how we can handle it, but I guess I stop it now, and then we will have time to talk about it.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. It'll be good to hear about those ideas. So I'm going to turn next to Geraldine.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon from South Africa. I'd like to raise about 3 or 4 points, but I want to start out by saying that my focus firstly is a bit on polarization, but I want to just indicate my initial reaction to the question, them and us. You know, I found it quite a difficult question, the us and them, because when I think of myself, and I think of myself as a South African and an African, the very us and them was something that my whole life was fighting against. The issue of difference, of othering, of looking at people as in being polarized. So that was the first issue that I thought I should put on the table, because I think that it is quite and could be seen as quite a delicate matter depending on where you sit. So for me, when looking at us and them, I thought, what are the biggest challenges both to us in South Africa and even globally? And I'd raise it because I think it's not necessarily a comfortable issue. And I think one of these big issues or big challenges is, of course, the whole question of increasing inequality in society. And I'll come back to that particular matter. But the second big issue is the issue of racism. And this is a big challenge because I believe parts of society and the world does not really own it. And I raise it coming from a movement that is one that has deeply been committed to non-racialism and is deeply committed to it. If one would look at the overall vision, one that says that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. And I raise this in the context of a sense of growing exceptionalism, but this at a global level, because I think there's dangers around this exceptionalism. The dangers of it is, I believe that it's a racist doctrine, that you believe that you have the right to tell everyone else what to do. And I'm going to link that to a further question that I know you'll be debating in the week ahead, but I think it's necessary to put it on the table today as well. And I would want to make an example made by the SG of the UN, when yesterday, I believe, in a broader discussion, he made a clear reference to Congo And the fact that more than 800 million people died in Congo, and this was clearly linked, I believe, to the whole issue of colonialism and racism. It goes to polarization, because there's the issue that there may be the arrogance and scorn of some people, complacency on the one side, imbalance of power, and what goes with it. Something that we fought against in South Africa. And yes, at the moment, we are seeing a whole range of challenges, but this is also one of what's there. And it could be argued, and we would argue, that we have tried to overcome this quite deliberately. And this has been through the way in which we have dealt with attaining our democracy, because it did not come out of any generosity from anywhere, reflected through the preamble of our constitution and the founding provisions that clearly states that we, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of our past, and that we respect those who have worked to build and develop our country. But our constitution itself talks about a common South African citizenship, all citizens that are equally entitled to rights, privileges, and benefits of citizenship, and equally subject to the duties and responsibility of citizenship. So, current problems that are there. We see increasing inequality in our society, as we see globally. But secondly, we have also had a situation where over a period during the past decade, there's also been what I would wish to call an aberration, where there's been a breakdown of some of our institutions. There has been almost if I could use the term of Frans Fanon, when he speaks about cognitive dissonance, the development, I would argue, in parts of society of factionalism, where there's been a support of people not by virtue only of the ideas and what they stand for, but the fact that they are seen to be a particular group that are leading particular views. Now, this is quite a difficult issue to discuss in the abstract, and we may wish to come back to it. But I feel it's the way in which it's quite easily to move away from a particular vision, from strong institutions, from investing in the populace, to diverting from that to the benefit of the few. I then want to very quickly move to a broader global point around polarization and us and them. And this links to the fact that I alluded to around exceptionalism and the dangers of that. One big threat, I believe, to us globally, and even specifically, is a crisis that we are seeing at a global level between US and China that's escalating, that potentially could lead to the developing of separate economies in a world, an increasingly global world that must and should be interconnected. The potential of two internets and all, and what does this mean? Because back to the concept of polarization, it's represented by unipolarity, where we become the victims of misinformation. And this is at a global level, could be national, could be legal, regional as well. And this needs to be dealt with as well. I then want to conclude with the differentiation between us and them and democratic practice. And back to South Africa. There was a moment in time when the us and them in our history was more easily identifiable. And when applying this in 2020, there's a need for us to be more textured, because there's a difference between opposing political positions and opposing worldviews that perpetuates the disempowerment and oppression of people. And here, when we look at rising inequality, we see a number of issues playing out. And I believe the big issue is, how do we overcome that? How do we reframe that? How do we ensure that there are not haves and have-nots when we look at our levels of inequality and poverty and the factors that perpetuate it? Because it actually counters our constitution. It counters the very vision we stand for. And maybe that's what I should pause on at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn to Michael next.
Thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be here with Sergio and Geraldine and Tawakol and Melanie, and greetings from Vienna. And little shout out to Port Elizabeth. If I'm right, Mandela University is in Port Elizabeth, and place
That's correct.
Kind of know, and I think it's a wonderful place. And so I salute the university and the colleagues from your university that I know and work with.
Thank you.
When I look at the us and them that bothers me most, it's actually about education. It's the division between those who have college degrees and higher education degrees and those who don't. I think this is genuinely global. If you and then not just this division on education, but the ways this division of education is then used by politicians to further polarization. The single biggest predictor on how you voted in Brexit, for example, in 2016, was the level of education. Those who didn't have college education tended to vote to leave the European Union. Those who had college education tended to vote to remain. If you look at the support for Donald Trump, it is not exclusively, but it's very strongly weighted towards those who have not, who have a high school degree, but not a college education. Heavily weighted towards those who have done manual labor and have missed the chance at college or community college. Education has become an enormously important divider in the world. I don't know how it plays out in Colombia, whether it cuts across some of the divisions that Sergio is talking about, or but I do know it also figures very largely in South Africa. There are class divisions, racial divisions, but there are also very strong educational divisions that cut across here. And this is, you know, I'm a university president, so it's very troubling to me. And it's surprising. It's surprising because I grew up in a generation that thought educational opportunity was the way to overcome polarization, to build an us based on common educational attainment. And we've had staggering growth in educational opportunity in the United States, in Britain, and Europe since the 1960s. I grew up in a world where my college degree was a rarity. Now in 2020, it's an extremely common attribute, and universities are growing globally to meet the demand for global education. But the unexpected consequence that we're facing is a tremendous backlash, a sense that universities and colleges are credentialing inequality. They are credentialing entitlement. They are digging in job ladders where you hit a ceiling if you don't have a degree. And so instead of empowering mobility, instead of empowering equality, instead of empowering access, instead of empowering people to get out of the prison house of race or gender, suddenly education is seen as a system that is locking certain equalities into place and credentialing those who benefit. And this should be troubling anybody like me who's in higher education. I mean, this morning, just before this call, I went down to welcome our incoming graduate, or our incoming undergraduate class, and we welcomed people from 100 countries. That's not unusual. I can't pat myself on the back. Harvard does the same. I'm sure great schools in Colombia and South Africa do the same. We had 2 students from South Africa, one online, one tuning in to our, and the mission of my university is to give all of these people a chance to break down the barriers that hold them back. But what we have instead is the surprising and discouraging discovery that populist politicians everywhere are using the educational divide to build power and mobilize bases. Sergio talks about a politics of enemies, but here's one of the places where it's being created. The deliberate cultivation of resentment towards those who have college educations, the deliberate cultivation of resentment towards those who have credentials, is a phenomenon of modern politics, and it potentially endangers universities in their future. But I'm not defending the university. My issue is, how do these polarizations occur? My university, as you know, was in Budapest for 25 years, very happily. We were created to help the transition between communism to free market economies. We lived in peace in the Hungarian milieu. And then suddenly in 2017, Viktor Orban, on the path to creating a single party state, decided it was to his electoral advantage to go after a US accredited institution that employed hundreds of Hungarians and was dug into Hungarian life. And they introduced legislation, passed in a week, no judicial review. I mean, this is what a single party state can do, just threw us out. And that's why I'm in Vienna. I'm not telling this story to tell you a sob story. We'll be fine, we'll survive. But to underline where polarization can lead in relation to education, he saw us as a very soft and easy target, a bastion of privilege, a bastion of the elite, and therefore the kind of thing that you can mobilize a base against. And this has wider implications. If you look at why in the pandemic there is such a constituency in Brazil, I hope, God help us, not in Colombia, such a constituency in South Africa for hostility towards scientific expertise, rejection of the mask, rejection of testing, rejection of social distancing. Some of this is the deliberate cultivation of suspicion towards credential experts. So it's not just that it's an us and them that is endangering universities and endangering the equality that we try to promote. It's also, I think, poisoning political discourse. It's making it much more difficult for us to organize a kind of common sense, centrist position around dealing with this pandemic. I'm absolutely stunned and shocked that, for example, wearing a mask has become a party political issue in some parts of the United States, some parts of Latin America. It just seems to me craziness, and dangerous craziness. But it relates to, I think, something, an us and them that has taken an educated, college-educated expert class and turned them into a kind of class enemy. Sergio talks about a politics of enemies. There's some way in which this elite has been turned into an enemy. And that seems to me profoundly dangerous. I mean, look, we can defend ourselves. I don't want to make this into a plea for an embattled elite, but I do want to say that the context in which we do university work, in which we preach the gospel of equality and equal opportunity, is much more difficult now than it ever was before. I'd be very interested to hear what my colleague from South Africa and Colombia and others have to say on this issue, because I think it's a cross-cutter. It's an issue that I think is relevant in each of our countries. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, I want to turn to Tawakol, and then maybe we'll have one more round of discussion before we open it up.
Okay, thank you so much. First of all, I'm so happy to be with you in the Global Empowerment Meeting organized by Center of International Development at Harvard University. Us and them. I think this saying, us and them, has always been the mother of all evil, since it's often expressed only by those having bad intentions toward others. History tells us how far this discrimination has contributed to devastating wars, protracted conflicts, and deep-rooted divisions. I know us and them may be a normal term to some people, and they might think it should not rise all this, doubt and fears. However, there is ample evidence that dividing people into opposite sides can't be out of the goodness. Rather, it is often driven by political, social, economic, or religious selfish interests. No matter they are related to an individual, a group, a political party, or a state. To me, in the 21st century, it is a very provocative subject. When I see some people see themselves distinguished based on their race, gender, sex, color, religion, region, or political affiliation, etc. But also I know the rule of political and religious despotism and the non-constructive rule of some authoritarian regimes in my region, and also Western countries as well, who have contributed on feeding discriminatory and intolerant ideas and their consequences, such as, as example, the Sunni Shiite discord unleashed across the Arab region after the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, escalated much more due to the also Iranian intervention in Iraq and Syria. Also, at the same time, the miserable Saudi rule in the region and also in all the Islamic world. In Yemen, the Iranian-Saudi conflict, along with the Houthi militia embracing racist ideas based on the exclusive divine right to rule, has contributed to deepening, social, divisions. Also, adopting the divide and rule policy, the Saudi UAE coalition have played a prominent role in widening local, contradictions and conflict and differences among Yemenis, in the belief that they, this would contribute to ensuring, their ambitions in Yemen and their occupation of Yemen, and also their destroying my country, Yemen. Of course, I know that of course, that it's difficult for any country on this planet to be free from this, the duality of us and them, like, Muslim and Christian, Jewish and Christian, Hindu and Muslim, Sunni and Shi'i, Catholic, Protestant and Orthodox, North and South, rich and poor, Arab and Western, European and Asian and African, black and white, women and men, and etc. But what we always need to draw attention to is political and religious despotism and its significant contribution to such contradictions and differences, and making people fear change in order to stay in power and seize control over wealth and resources. Wars, conflicts, and hate campaigns here or there are carried out by people despising human diversity of its different degree, because they see in it a threat to their own beliefs and existence. Unfortunately, only peoples pay the price for these stupidities and abnormal thoughts. The worst thing done by narrow-minded and closed regimes and groups is to thwart, every attempt to bring people closer or promote their coexistence. Thus, we must have a clear position against any, divisive or discriminatory calls for hegemonies, political or economic gains. Here, I would, at the end of my intervention, I would like to draw attention to the fact that no one can ignore that people will remain different. With this differences, the society become strong and rich. But also, what also I want, to assure that the most widespread distinction I look to is that between freedom and democracy's advocates and dictators and their allies. I believe that solidarity and standing together in the face of tyranny and political, religious, and economic exploitation are the best slogan to reduce any negative effects that may arise from both either natural or artificial differences between people.
Thank you all so much. I just want to build on some of the comments you made and throw out a general question to everyone. And we're running a little tight on time, so if you could each just briefly respond. One of the things I've noticed in my own research on post-conflict toleration and reconciliation is that once identities or divisions, social cleavages have been politicized, it's extremely hard to bring down tensions. And Tawakol's example just now of the so-called Sunni-Shia divide is a real case in point, but we can all think of other examples. So each of you has had an important leadership experience, whether in government or civil society, and have worked in places experiencing tensions that have ratcheted up that you've witnessed. So I wonder if you might draw on your insights to tell us how, one way in which you've seen people overcome polarization or work together to address a common challenge. And if you don't want to answer that one, you can turn it over to something else. It might be a tough one to answer. So Sergio, do you have a perspective on this? Or?
As I told you at the beginning, we are in a very, for me, incredible situation. Here we have a country, a wonderful country, Colombia. We have had violence for 50 years associated with guerrillas, narco traffic. You all know about this world. And we haven't been able to get together in order to build peace. And we have been divided by building peace in our society. That's incredible because we know the costs of violence. Now, we are in the middle of this problem and it's increasing. Let me put it this way. We were supposed to be passing the page in order to be able to write a new one in Colombia. And we were in the middle of passing the page and we got stuck in here. So we haven't finished passing or going back to where we were. So we are stuck. And this is going to be a political problem, a political solution that we have to come up with a new way of understanding among us. I was thinking, in the previous years, Colombians, we were sort of united because we had, as a whole, as a society, being confronted by narco-traffickers who wanted to destroy all of us, guerrillas who wanted to harm all of us. But now the problem is among ourselves, and we haven't been able to handle that. And with the very basic principles about democracy and how you build reconciliation in a society who has been suffering. And we get used to that way of handling by destruction, hurting the one who is different. And we haven't had the opportunity to go to the problem that Michael has mentioned, because we haven't had the chance to bet, for example, on education as a national project. We still are stuck in this problem. And just to say a few words about it, we are in the middle of the political confrontation, and it is going to continue. And I, as many other people, of course, and I think the majority in Colombia, don't belong to the extremes. We don't belong to the extremes, but the loud voices that come from those extremes, the shouting, doesn't allow other people to speak. You cannot hear other voices in the middle of that confrontation. So we have to come up with a new frequency where we connect to people who are not in the streams, who believe in that simple phrase that I mentioned before: we can be different without being enemies, which is just at the very essence of democracy. That's not much more than that. But I think we have to continue, persevere, refused, and by no means accept getting into the battlefield. We have to be exemplary in the way we use language, and being patient, being disciplined, using our behavior as an example of things that can be done. Usually, if you do that, and that's happened to me every day, they tell you you are warm. And people who are coming into this discussion, they want to have war. And war is for people who are really valiant people. But my claim is keep on. Don't stop. Don't get scared. Be peaceful. Show that you can handle all these inconveniences, all these aggressions without getting into their battlefield. And of course, we have to find a way, and that's one of the challenges, to move in this digital world where you need to explain the most difficult concept, the deepest concept in 20 seconds in order to be able to have a video that could be viral. And we have to work on that. We have to persevere, teaching, give an example, pedagogy. And my claim is that being coherent, being consistent through time, that you end up having reason, and eventually we will defeat that. But that's a tough job.
Thank you so much. Great insights. Geraldine, do you have some thoughts? Briefly, of course.
Yes, I have. I'm going to try to make it as brief as I can, and there are three sorts. There's thoughts. There are three examples. Post the unbanning of the national liberation movements in South Africa in 1990, post 1990, there was violence that was projected as black on black violence. It was there was evidence that was presented later that it was also state-sponsored violence. And to deal with that, there was the coming together of major stakeholders in society, civil society, the trade union movement and others, that led to the setting up of what was called the National Peace Accord. And the National Peace Accord was one that had structures from community levels right up to national levels in an attempt to look at how best to deal with violence in society at that point in time, because this was deliberately engineered. The second example is one that's quite global, and it was also drew from the Chilean model, which was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the purpose of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was an opportunity for South Africans to deal with our past and involving all sides. There was an eminent panel led by Bishop Desmond Tutu that led this. The one challenge around that is what do you do post such a process? Because it can't just end by people unburdening themselves to publicly. There's got to be more. And there was a reparation and other programs around that, but I think not adequately followed through. The last one, which is current one, and it links to my point on inequalities earlier, is the fact with the growing inequality in South African society, the fact that we are going through a major economic depression, so to speak, and this was both pre-COVID and exacerbated by COVID. There has been social compacting once again. And here through NEDLAC, which brings together this constituency of government, the private sector, and broad civil society, as well as the trade unions, they have looked at what they call a national growth strategy. What is required is to ensure that that strategy is catalytic to overcome inequality. So I'll pause on that and say that there's a need to be quite creative, but you've got to bring all players together. It's got to be coalitions across. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you. And Michael?
Well, I think the first thing to remember about democracy is democracy's overriding purpose is to prevent arguments and polarizations ending in violence and civil war and killing. And so sometimes democracies that have had a heritage and tradition of stability, when they see violence beginning to emerge in the political system, draw back mightily and can find the resources to depolarize simply because everybody looks at the abyss and says, we've been there and we don't want to go back. The Colombian case is particularly tragic and shocking because you had 50 years in the abyss and then you got close to peace, and now, you know, what's going to keep Colombia going over the abyss? Everybody deciding we don't want to go over to the abyss again. You know, in other cases, you know, the Yemeni case is particularly horrible because the country has been destroyed by an external proxy war where, you know, Yemenis of good conscience and good heart, if left alone, if external forces weren't poisoning and pulverizing the society, might be able to draw back from the abyss. I mean, so I think it depends critically whether, and I guess Sergio was hinting on this, whether you can get a large enough people in the middle who say, listen, this polarization is driving us over the cliff. Whatever else we disagree about, we don't want to go over the cliff together. I mean, we may be approaching this moment in the United States. If the election in November is disputed, we are not, I think I'm a Canadian here, so I want to be careful about saying anything stupid about the States, but it's not inconceivable that there could be political violence in the wake of a disputed election in the United States. At that point, people who disagree about everything, blue, red, Republican, Democrat, might think, oh, wait a minute, there is one thing that is worse than our arguments, and that would be political violence. So let's stop this now. Sometimes polarization ends simply because there is something worse than polarization, and that is war. Unfortunately for Tawakol's wonderful country, it's too late for that. War has happened and it's having terrible effects. But I kind of pray in democracies that if we all remember that the purpose of a democracy is to avoid war, if war is imminent, if the precipice is imminent, people may just draw back. That's, I guess, the most hopeful thing I can say.
Well, I'll take that. Tawakol, if you could just briefly give us some insights on, based on your experiences.
Okay, thank you so much. I really briefly, it's very hard to speak briefly about our experience in Yemen. Look, the dangerous, game that the dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh played before is on playing on this pluralization. What did he do? He ruled Yemen by the divide and rule, and this is what he did. During all his period in 33 years, he incites differences between sects, between classes, between tribes and and cities, between north and south, between ideologies. So that was his best game, and because of that, he ruled Yemen in all that 33 years. And when we decided to make to stop this game, we decided to make all Yemenis together, to speak one voice, to think about this polarization is our richness. We can build a new Yemen by our pluralization. We can build our new Yemen by our differences, and we should stop any gate of the dictator. He enter through this playing through the differences. In our peaceful revolutions, we call all Yemenis that was fighting for decades. We told them to stop fighting, to throw their weapons. And as you know, that Yemeni people own more than 70 million pieces of weapons, and with their differences, they solve their problems within themselves, and also with the government, with with violence, with their weapons. But we encourage them to go to the street peacefully and to throw their weapons, and to come with us in one square, under one tent, all of us, many tents, gather all our differences, and we should be one voice against the dictatorship. And look, Yemenis people, by their differences and by their peaceful means and tools, they could force the dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh to step down. Look, how did we overcome the pluralization? And in some tents there is tribes that been fighting each other for decades. They stayed in one tent, eat with each other, and also die with each other. And now after our winning against the dictator, because we are in our peaceful revolution, still we are in the revolution, but after we overcome, we force the dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh to leave the authority peacefully. And then when we enter to the national dialogue, and this is a very good and very big, important example, and how can Yemeni people sit with each other with all their differences, with all their, even, past conflicts. We sit with each other, in the national dialogue, and we write a great, national dialogue outcomes and a great, draft of constitution. All of us, parties, tribes, and even with militia. All the differences, all the Yemeni people, parties, not just political parties, from every, sects, from every sides, from every ideology, sit in one table and did a great work. And we managed the transitional period in a very good way. There was some mistakes, but Yemeni people did a great work and, led the transitional period in a good way, and also write a good draft of constitution. Now the problem is that we are facing an ugly counter-revolution led by Saudi, UAE coalition from one side, and also Iran from another side. both of them are playing a very bad game, and the same game that the dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh played. But worse than that, especially Saudi and Emirates. Now they provoke Yemenis from north and provoke Yemenis from south, and they said to us we should be a divided country, and they spread hate because they want to continue their occupation in Yemen, and they want to continue their war in Yemen. But I am I agree with Mr. Michael on Dr. Michael on most of his speech and comments. But the last thing that I didn't agree with him, that it is too late to Yemeni people. No, Yemeni people can overcome all their differences. And now this civil war, it is not caused by Yemeni people. It's caused by first Saudi, UAE, and then Iran. And if Saudi and UAE stop their intervention, you will see how Yemeni people can manage their differences and can come again to the dialogue again and can build Yemen. We are ready for that. And at least, we will win this battle, because this is the battle of freedom. This is a battle of democracy. We are the fighter for democracy against those dictators and against those allies, their allies, and especially the counter-revolutions, and also the Western government that support them, that support Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed to destroy us and to destroy our, richness, our polarization, and, our will for freedom and democracy. And we will not give up, and we will continue our fight for that.
Thank you so much.
Melanie, is it possible to come in? I know that you have a slate of questions, but just a comment.
Yes, very quickly. We have about 20 minutes left for questions, so I want to open it up as soon as possible, but please.
Yeah, I just think, listening to the points raised, I mean, the big issue as well, or maybe the elephant in the room, is multilateralism. Mm-hmm. And the fact that there's been almost an erosion of multilateralism, because we know that unipolarism also feeds into greater polarization across the globe, and I think if we listen to what Tawakol raises, we listen to the point by Michael as well, and even Sergio. And this is one thing that's got to be reviewed, and just a very strong consideration on how we deal with it, because democracy on its own doesn't answer all questions, and hence the formation of the UN in the first instance. Sorry, just as an aside.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for bringing in the multilateral dimension. So we have about 20 minutes for Q&A, and I know some of our attendees have posed questions. Adriana from CID is going to help us out reading off some of the questions, but did some of our attendees want to pose them directly? Okay. So I wonder if Sarah or Adriana wants to read out some of the questions that we have here.
Yes, absolutely. I think that Alan from Argentina was going to join us and ask his question directly. I don't know if he's already with us and able to ask. Oh, yes, there he is.
Yes, I'm here. I'm here. Thank you very much. Thank you all for the invitation. Thank you, panelists, for very interesting remarks. Hello, Sergio. I think I was looking into this issue. It seems like the issue of polarization has like two dimensions, as I was writing down, one a short term and another one a more structural and long term. On the short term, when we look at democracies, it seems that it pays to polarize in terms of electoral votes. It seems that it is a easy way of fighting the political battle in trying to polarize and to win that battle. And on the other hand, we hear in a lot of countries, in Argentina being one of them, their ambition, the need, the desire to have people talking and reaching agreements. But then you see the media, this is no news. I mean, having people agreeing is no news. It pays off for the media to show people fighting, arguing, shouting. And that creates obviously a cognitive bias in people with the situation. So, and on the long term, we have this discussion on the results of democracy and capitalism with people being left out. So we have two dimensions, but there is limited or there's a thrust in the long term. How do we fight this? But how do we fight these two dimensions, and specifically the short term one, in order to change values underlying discussions?
Great. And I think in the interest of time, it might make sense to take a few questions together and then allow the panelists to respond to whichever they choose.
Yes, I can add a couple more questions that we've received. We have a question coming from Rashi Kilnani from in YouTube for Michael, asking about the specific circumstances in Canada. College education is widespread in Canada. Still, our small economy means not all educated people are employed. Those with ethnic names are less likely to be interviewed for jobs. What are your views on these? And then we have another question coming here on the chat from James from Nigeria. He mentions that it's now 50 years since the end of the Nigeria civil war that took the lives of over 3 million Southeasterns, including women and children. There has been a structural imbalance since then, and the losers of that war are still suffering till date and up to the third generation. Nigeria government response has been that of suppression. The root causes of that war have still not been addressed, leading to resentment and to the emergence of new youth rebel groups. What is the systemic solution for this? And then I can add another one from Marcela Renteria from Chile. Using the words of Sergio, we know that the cost of violence and we are stuck. How do you get a political solution if the president himself is not prioritizing reconciliation among Colombians? Maybe we can stop here and then we can add more questions to a second round if we have enough time.
Okay, maybe Sergio, you want to kick us off since a couple of these questions were directed at you in particular?
Let me start with Marcela and the paradox that we are facing. The president who won the election in the year 2018 he voted no for the peace agreement, but he has the mandate to carry out the peace agreements. So you can imagine the situation that we live. Someone who didn't want the peace process being signed, and now in power, he has the obligation to carry out with that peace process. And of course, that leads to all these confrontations. And listening to the experience in Nigeria, and as a matter of fact, in many other places throughout Latin America, for example, in Central America, Guatemala, to be more explicit, for example. After all these years, after having had a peace agreement, the conditions haven't changed. And that's something that we have to keep in mind in Colombia. A peaceful reconstruction of the country, the reconciliation takes years, but it takes the quality of the leader in order to be able to build that peace process. If we don't have leaders who believe in the reconciliation and in creating the conditions associated with the social inequalities, all the issues that have been had in front of us for so many years, we are not going to have peace. It's going to be a political issue. It has to do with the leadership that we have to have in order to reconcile a country, and that's quite a challenge. Nelson Mandela, for me, is always the inspiring figure of a human being who came out of a prison and he was able to carry out what he did. Many things have happened since, but he had the spirit in order to build peace and translated that spirit to their people. And that's what we don't have yet, and we need it urgently. And it's not going to come out of a polarization process where fear, anger are the key sensations, emotions, in order to defeat the one who is different. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Anyone else from the panel want to respond? Michael.
Just one quick thing. I thought I was very struck by how wise a remark it was. What one of our questioners said, it pays to polarize. You bet it pays to polarize. I was in elected politics. That's your job. You polarize in order to win power. But I think that there is always a countervailing force in politics as well. You have a responsibility to your party. You have a responsibility to win power, and therefore you have a responsibility to polarize, to create difference. But at the same time, you have an obligation to the system itself. And I think what's worrying everybody about political systems around the world is that the leaders don't appear to have any responsibility to the system. That is, to keeping the system going, to keep it from going over the cliff, from polarizing to an excessive degree. In every democracy, there's this tension. You know how far to push polarization, and then you pull back. And you pull back not because you're so noble, but because you don't want them to do it to you. So there's some tacit rules in democracy that balance it and keep it from lurching into extremism. It's a matter of concern in every country that you look at. The United States, Colombia, Britain, I can go around the board, that this sense of let's not push polarization too far because it's going to damage the system itself. It's going to make it impossible for us to get results that everybody needs. That sense of responsibility to the system has weakened, and that's a source of concern, I think, everywhere.
Great. We do have a couple more questions, but do either Geraldine or Tawakol want to come in now, or shall we turn to some more questions?
I think turn to more, and then we may come in and respond to this and what comes up. Yeah.
I agree.
Adriana, do you want to?
Yes, I can read a couple more questions. Barbara Barungi from Uganda mentions that South Africans still carry deep scars of apartheid, deepening inequality, and the millions of jobless youth are losing hope in ANC that has failed to deliver on many promises to make a better life for all. What does the political future hold for South Africa? We also have a question from Hernando Jose Gomez from Colombia, mentioning that social media platforms are being used to spread fake news and hatred. And so he's asking what can be done to regulate these platforms without hindering free expression. What's the role of companies that advertise? How can these social media platforms be used to protect the truthfulness of information they spread? Related to these, we also had a question on YouTube saying that, and also related to Colombia, so I'm linking them both, mentioning that it's hard because sometimes when you protest your rights in Colombia, media tag you as being part of the guerrilla. So how should media be held accountable for polarization and not just the government? We have also another question on YouTube from Hiba Sali, mentioning that it's always been the case that external powers, forces, and agendas dismantle organically developed civilizations and otherwise very peaceful coexisting multi-ethnic nations. It's only in an induced civilization that she's seen an eruption of semi-revolution from within, like in the US. So she's asking speakers whether they have any reflections on this process.
Great. So why don't we turn to Geraldine first, and then Tawakol if you'd like to come in.
Thank you. Barbara asks a difficult question. What does the future hold for South Africa and South African politics? I spoke about inequality, and I spoke about the issue of social compacting, looking at economic growth to overcome inequality, hopefully not overcome inequality, but look at economic growth in South Africa. And the one issue that I do want to raise is that the inequality we're seeing in South Africa is not unique to South Africa itself. I think globally we've seen a recession even pre-COVID, And as reflected, I think, by Guterres, he said COVID has just served as an X-ray that actually highlighted the extent of the challenges in society. That we have disillusioned youth because of unemployment, I think that is the case, and that's actually the case across the African continent. I think the two positives and strong things in South Africa is that we have quite a vocal civil society, and we also have a strong press. But I think I want to go to a point that Michael had made, but make it more specific to our situation, is that we have to invest in our youth more and invest in their education, because we've had a huge deficit. That's not one that's just from today, but it's something that's come before. Looking at education as well, it's not just looking at skills development for the here and now, but also for the future. And I think we've not done as well as we could around that, in spite of the investment into the overall budget. But coming to politics in South Africa, South African politics is polarized, but it's not only polarized between parties, it's even within parties. And a word that's not been used today is the reality that we're also seeing factions emerging. But I think to a large extent, Sergio has spoken about that, and that's a phenomenon in South Africa. I do believe, however, Barbara, that we are resilient people. And I think to a large degree, we've got to look within ourselves to overcome the challenges that are there. And we probably need to allow different political thinking to come through to make a difference, and probably look towards the youth to lead as well. I don't think it will only come from the old. Last point I want to make, and it's not in response to that question only, but to Sergio's point, when he spoke about the strength of Nelson Mandela and the fact that he was an iconic leader, not just for South Africa, but globally, is the fact that he was not a leader on his own. There was a strong collective he drew on. And I think this is something we'll have to bear in mind, that it's not just about individual leaders, because when that individual is gone, you have a big problem. And we also need to develop strong collectives as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I want to give the opportunity for Tawakol to respond. And then we have a question from the earlier round that was directed at Michael. Maybe we can return to about employment and education in Canada in particular.
I'm going to answer about the question about social media. You know, it's very important that we empower, you know, the people voices. We should protect those platforms, you know, the social media platforms, from misusing of the authoritarian regimes that use this social media to oppress, you know, the voices of people. Also, who attack expression rights in the real life and also in the internet life, who are so afraid from expression rights, who are so afraid from the social media. Social media played a great work to make people around the world to be closer to each other. From, you know, all religions, from all countries, from all colors, they become closer and closer, and they become understanding each other, and understanding also each other's, you know, issues, and helping each other, supporting each other. Now social media platforms are, you know, suffer from the bad interfere of the governments who are using these platforms, you know, who are you know, spreading, you know, the fake accounts, fake news, misinformation. And when I talk about authoritarian regimes, when I talk about governments, when I talk about international companies and their allies, that they are so afraid from expression rights. So what we should do to protect the differences between people is to empower those people, is to empower voices, is to protect freedom of expression, to don't push those people who are different to use violent tools. So to encourage them to continue on their non-violent tools, to express on their beliefs, on their goals and dreams, peacefully. We need to empower. Also, we need to defend on democracy. We need to empower people and the right leadership to care and love one another. We need to disrupt the voices of hate, violence as one all across the world. And that is very simple. And we can do it. We can do it. Together, we can do it, from small villages and towns to the international and urban cities. We need to keep pushing and never give up on people and on our hopes. And again, we should raise our voices against those who destroy our differences.
Thank you. And I want to raise one question we didn't get to from the chat earlier, noting that there is widespread college education in Canada, but problems with employment for university graduates, particularly those that hold last names indicating they're from underrepresented minorities. And I should say that this is a phenomenon that's been documented broadly across many different contexts. There's a lot of social science research in the US showing that, when you send identical CVs to employers, but vary the last name or other pieces of information on the CV, we have very clear evidence of discrimination. So perhaps, Michael, you want to jump in since the reference was to Canada, but I'm sure everyone has thoughts on this.
Just very quickly, before I get to that, just to pick up something that Tawakol was saying about social media, it's central to the polarization story. And one of the reasons social media is central to polarization is that on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. That is, you don't have to take responsibility. You're not identified. And this is licensed malice, hatred, attacks. We've got a political technology here that is revolutionizing politics. We haven't got it under control. And I think that in itself is one of the key drivers of polarization. Tawakol is talking about the ways it's used by governments, but it's also used by ordinary citizens. And some of the ways in which it disinhibits us all from being responsible is a source of real anxiety. And I think the solution there is regulation. I think there's absolutely no reason why the public space of our democracy should be owned by 2 or 3 people who kind of decide that they'll regulate it themselves. I think this is a huge challenge for democracy around the world. And if we could get our social media platforms minimally regulated, I think we could depolarize a lot of our society. Now, let me pick up the question about education very quickly. There is simply no doubt that people with non-standard names, God, look at my name, it's non-standard, but people with non-standard names have historically encountered difficulty in the job market. This is a challenge we can overcome because, frankly, it's the dumbest thing in the world. The great revolution in education in the United States and Europe since the 1960s has been the entry of migrant groups, immigrant groups, people from every confessional group, every race, every religion, women have surged into higher education. And the results have been transformative and nothing but positive in their impact. It's been the great good story about education. The idea that having done all that, then they get out with a degree and they find some stupid employer saying, I'm not going to employ her because it looks like a Muslim name, or I'm not going to employ her because she's a woman, or I'm not going to employ because he sounds as if he's Caribbean, is the classic example of an employer shooting themselves in the foot. And so universities need to work with employers groups need to wake up and stop this idiotic behavior because it's damaging their own interests. It's not only a violation of human rights, it's not only a violation of the interests of the students, it's a catastrophic mistake for employers. And that's why I'm optimistic that it can eventually be overcome, because it's just so dumb.
Great. Well, this has been a fantastic panel. Unfortunately, we're basically out of time. And I think we've had, a good opportunity to delve into this issue of polarization. I'm sure this is going to come up across the rest of the week. It is heartening to hear the words of our panelists. There is hope there, including in their own experiences. Most people do want to step back from the cliff. Of course, this will require coordination on the part of leadership, and we have examples of leadership from yourselves and also from many of the people that you've cited in your remarks and the experiences that you've attested to. But leadership alone is not going to solve the problem. We also need those leaders to address the underlying structural issues that many of you have highlighted, whether they come in the form of socioeconomic, racial, ethnic inequalities, or the failure of multilateral governance to rein in interventions in conflicts, domestic conflicts, and so forth. So these kinds of issues need to be tackled by capable leaders with visions, and to do so, and in order to make this sort of overwhelming group of people that don't want to step over the cliff realize that goal. So unfortunately, we are out of time for today. I apologize if we didn't get to all the questions. And I want to remind you that tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern time, there's going to be another really excellent panel with a bunch of specialists addressing the question of the morality of us and them. So thank you very much to all of our distinguished panelists. And I'm sorry we couldn't meet in person. I would have loved to continue the conversation in person. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hope to meet you all again. Thank you. Bye.